Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anupama, Professor at Department of Economics, Punjabi University, Patiala. I am here talking on behalf of Dr. Falendra Kumar Sudan, Professor, Department of Economics, University of Jammu. I am going to talk about the module Children and Climate Change from Demography of Climate Adaptation. So students, we are going to discuss about the impact of climate change on children. We will also discuss about the policy options to reduce the adverse effects of climate change on children. Climate change is a global issue and addressing it is a shared responsibility. Yet, it is clear that the developing countries and most vulnerable people will bear the brunt of climate change. The failure to act will render millions of children and their families more hazardous. Many people already live in fragile climates where food and clean water are scarce and shelters inadequate. Climate change will exacerbate this fragility. Children in Africa and Asia are already facing a future with more likely and intense disasters. Economic growth will falter and incomes fall. Disease outbreaks will be more frequent. Clean water and good sanitation will be harder to secure. Habitats and communities will be less stable. As a result, children may also have to cope with higher levels of conflict. Besides, other pressures will keep them out of school and force them into work too soon. Many developing countries have poor infrastructure and lack the technologies. Therefore, these nations are unable to cope with the changing climate, such as flood defenses and early warning systems. They are more vulnerable to the impact of climate change, and their children are the most vulnerable of all. The potential impact on children has been a critical missing element in discussion about climate change. Hence, this module aims to describe how children are affected by climate change, to draw implications of climate change on children, to answer the questions why are children important in a climate change perspective, where are children particularly affected or at risk, how are children affected by climate change, and what roles do children have when addressing the climate change, and to rapidly develop a greater understanding of the impact of climate change on children and take appropriate measures to protect them from its consequences. Anthropogenic climate change. The climate change occurs due to natural variability and human activity. The exact role of anthropogenic influence on climate change is impossible to determine. Climate change affects children in a bigger way. The severity of climate change depends not only on climate change itself, but also on exposure and vulnerability. Exposure and vulnerability are dynamic, varying across temporal and spatial scales, and depend on economic, socio-geographic, demographic, cultural, institutional, governance, and environmental factors. For instance, a tropical cyclone can have very different impacts depending on where and when it makes its landfall. A heat wave can have very different impacts on different populations depending on their vulnerability. Extreme impacts can result from individual extreme weather or climate events, but also from non-extreme events where exposure and vulnerability are high, or from a compounding events or their impacts. Climate change related weather events also affect vulnerability to future events by modifying resilience, coping capacity, and adaptive capacity. Settlement patterns, urbanization, and changes in socioeconomic conditions have all influenced observed trends in exposure and vulnerability to climate extremes. Individuals and communities are also differently exposed and vulnerable based on inequalities expressed through levels of wealth and education, disability, health status, as well as gender, age, class, and other social and cultural characteristics. Now we can discuss the climate change and sustainable development. Our climate is warming. The extent of human contribution to climate change is more frequently contested. The greenhouse gases have known to cause a warming of the Earth's surface. The effects of climate change will make it harder to achieve the internationally agreed Millennium Development Goals and to sustain development progress. There is need to understand the implications of climate change for the world's poorest people. The impact of climate change depends on hazard and vulnerability. Hazard implies the susceptibility to the physical effects of climate change, for example, drought, flood, storms, and changes in weather patterns. Vulnerability implies the sensitivity of a country's physical, economic, social, and political systems to the effects of climate change, including its ability to anticipate and adapt to those effects. An important part of the world's population may face dry season water shortages. The hardest hit regions may be unable to sustain their present population. Rising sea levels may trigger the displacement of hundreds of millions of people. Increasing incidence and severity of adverse weather events will constrain development. Climate vulnerability correlates closely to the levels of development. Developing countries have lower economic diversification. These nations are more dependent on agriculture. The households have lower incomes and savings, and poor education and health status. Poor communities and households more vulnerable to rapid shocks and effects of climate change. Fragile states are particularly vulnerable to conflicts over scarce natural resources. They experience the destabilizing effects of forced migration. Resource conflicts pose major risks to fragile states, particularly those with serious ethnic or religious divisions. Their ability to adapt is restricted. There is limited capability to invest in disaster preparedness and strengthening livelihood resilience. Human impact of climate change. There are numerous consequences of climate change which are not identified as directly hazardous to people. These include the earlier arrival of spring with resulting changes in bird migration, egg laying, and the greening of vegetation, and the shifting of plant and animal species into new geographical zones. There have been changes in areas of snow, ice, and frozen ground. The runoff into rivers fed by glaciers has increased. Some marine and freshwater species also appear to be altering their range and number. The long-term impact on humans is only just emerging. The projections of future climate change suggest worse is to come. Significant impacts on water stress, agriculture productivity, and human health are projected. There will be warning of 2 to 3 degrees across the globe within next 50 years. This will be largely the result of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. It will cause rising sea levels to threaten large cities in Africa and the densely populated river deltas of the Ganges and Mekong. Glacier melting is likely to disrupt water supplies in Asia and Latin America. All this will impact most of the children in developing countries who are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Adaptation capacity is fundamental to assessing their vulnerability. The countries and communities that are unable to participate, that are unable to anticipate and respond to climate change impacts are at greatest risk. There is need to support the poorest and most vulnerable to cope with the likely impacts of climate change. So let us look at the children in climate change perspective. There are many vulnerable persons to climate change. Its impact are not spread equally across location, economic status, gender, or age. Children, especially children of the poor families, are affected in a detrimental manner. Children are less equipped to deal with deprivation and stress. For instance, children have more rapid metabolisms, immature organs and nervous systems, developing cognition as well as limited experience and behavioral characteristics. Their exposure to various risks is also more likely to have long-term repercussions than the adults. Children under age 15 are 44%. They are more likely to die because of environmental factors. Small children are most likely to be the victims of extreme events such as flooding, strong winds, and landslides. Girls are generally more exposed than boys. Mortality rates are more extreme for young children. Crude mortality is 1 per 10,000 per day and under 5 mortality is double. The risk exposure is 100% higher for small children. Overall death rates for young children continue to drop due to improved healthcare, immunization rates, and environmental conditions. Many children in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are at risk from biggest killers, that is diarrhea, respiratory diseases, malaria, and malnutrition. According to the Climate Change Vulnerability Index 2014, 20 countries were ranked to be in the extreme risk category, of which practically all are situated in a belt around of equator and in Africa and South or Southeast Asia. About 737 million children under 15 years currently live in the 20 countries considered at the extreme risk of negative impact from climate change. Climate change and MDGs. The Millennium Development Goals relating to the child survival and child health by 2015 are discussed as follows. The Goal 1 aims to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. The Goal 4 aims to reduce by 2/3 the mortality rate of children under the age of 5. The Goal 5 aims to reduce by 3/4 the maternal mortality ratio. The Goal 6 aims to halt and begin to reverse the spread of HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other major diseases. Climate change will adversely impact the achievement of MDG. The failure to address climate change could lead to huge reductions in the welfare of people across the world. There will be likely cuts in global per capita consumption of 5 to 20% now and forever. These impacts could be similar to those associated with World Wars I and II and the economic depression of the 1930s. There will be an increasing risk of shocks. Climate change will have an overall adverse impact on livelihoods. All MDGs relating to children, including health, education, and gender equality, will be adversely impacted. The impact of climate change on livelihoods will be sudden in case of droughts and floods, or slower but cumulative in case of other situations. For instance, the falling agriculture output and deteriorating conditions in rural areas caused by climate change will increase poverty. The developing countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America are forecast to see reductions in agriculture productivity between 5 to 25% by 2080s due to climate change. Water and sanitation. The waterborne diseases like diarrhea, cholera, and typhoid claim the lives of millions of children. Water and sanitation related diseases are one of the major causes of under 5 mortality. Nearly 4,800 children die per day from diarrhea alone. Children with little or no access to clean water are the most vulnerable. Access to safe and clean water is becoming scarce. Climate change dries up the water tables and depletes rainfall. The poor communities better the devastating effects of drought in developing countries. The drought in southern Africa is due to warming of the Indian Ocean by more than 1 degree Celsius since 1950. Rather than falling over the land, rain dwells in the rising air above the warm ocean. For example, there was 20% decline in summer rainfall in southern Africa between 1950 and 99, and 10% drop in rainfall can reduce river flows by 50% or more. Rural areas are devastated by the loss of water due to frequent droughts. Women have the responsibility of water carriers. They are far more affected than men. For example, in Zambia, if water is not nearby, they must travel sometimes for days to get it. This can be life-shattering for the girls who spend most of their day collecting water, with little time left for education. But there is hope through UNICEF's innovation schemes for safeguarding clean and sustainable water supplies in Zambian schools. UNICEF can play an important role in increasing sanitation standards and access to clean, safe water through education and water management programs. Simple, sustainable techniques like carbon-free roundabout play pumps and rainwater harvesting can mean the difference between life and death for communities. Children's rights and climate change. Children have the absolute right to live in a decent environment. They have right to attend school, enjoy good health, and live and grow in safety. The UN Convention on Rights of the Child, that is CRC, is the world's most widely ratified human rights treaty. All child rights are interconnected, for instance, child survival and child health, and the right to live. Governments should ensure that children survive and develop healthily. Children have the right to good quality healthcare, the best healthcare possible, to safe drinking water, nutritious food, a clean and safe environment, and information to help them stay healthy. Rich countries should help poorer countries achieve this. All children have the right to a primary education, which should be free. Wealthy countries should help poorer countries achieve this right. Children have the right to special protection and help if they are refugees or if they have been forced to leave their home and live in another country. Governments must do everything they can to protect and care for children affected by war. When adults are making decisions that affect children, children have the rights to say what they think should happen and have their opinions taken into account. Impact on children. Climate change causes death in children under the age of 5. Children suffer from acute respiratory infections, diarrhea diseases, and malaria. About 5,000 children die every day due to poor sanitation and a lack of clean drinking water. There are more than 1 million deaths per annum due to malaria, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. Nearly 50 million people are infected annually with dengue. Children are more likely to suffer due to dengue infection. There are significant levels of child morbidity and mortality due to natural disasters, malnutrition, heat stress, respiratory illness, diarrhea, and vector-borne diseases. The pressures on both large-scale and small-scale farming are likely to have consequences for nutrition. Crop volumes and crop diversity may be constrained by water and other climate-related stresses. Livestock will also be affected by the changing environment with consequences for the availability of meat and dairy products. All of these factors will affect the ability of parents to feed themselves and their children. Malnutrition is a leading cause of infant and child mortality. The proportion of underweight children in Africa is likely to grow to 26.8% in 2015. The changing patterns of communicable disease distribution present a significant threat to infants and children. Climate change plays its role. The impact of climatic variability on vector-borne diseases has been significant. For example, the transmission of mosquito-borne diseases such as malaria currently claims the lives of around 8 lakh children every year. Changes in environmental factors are facilitating malaria transmission in areas where it had previously been eliminated. The likely incidence of dengue due to climate change could increase to 3.5 billion by 2080, up from 1.5 billion at present. Currently, around 1.1 billion people in developing countries have inadequate access to water, and 2.6 billion people lack basic sanitation. The countries with low access to water are most vulnerable to existing and potential climate change. Bangladesh, for example, is under increased pressure of flooding, while Ethiopia and Niger are threatened by drought and land degradation. Increased rainfall and flooding in urban areas are likely to exacerbate sanitation problems in future. The threat of waterborne diseases such as cholera will likely to grow in many countries. Strengthening urban water and sanitation infrastructure to cope with these additional pressures is therefore of high priority. Non-communicable diseases may also be triggered due to climate change. There is evidence of escalating childhood asthma in areas with high ground level ozone. Heat or cold stress will increase child deaths from heat exhaustion and hypothermia. There is anxiety about future climate change impact on children's mental health. Natural disasters will exacerbate the burden of depression, anxiety, and stress. In addition to exacerbating the existing communicable and non-communicable disease burden, climate change has the potential to stimulate the emergence of new diseases. For example, zoonosis, disease that originate in animal species, often mutate and emerge in humans in response to changing environmental conditions. Examples of zoonotic diseases include plague, tuberculosis, and avian influenza strain H5N1. Emerging diseases often cause high levels of mortality, particularly in children who are more vulnerable. Climate change could cause an additional 40,000 to 160,000 child deaths per year in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Under a high climate change scenario, this increases to an additional 60,000 to 250,000 child deaths per year by 2100. These projections are simply illustrative of possible risks associated with the loss in income due to climate change. Mitigating climate change. The impact of climate change on children can be mitigated to some degree through an intensification of existing strategies such as childhood immunization program, the upgrading of water and sanitation infrastructure, and the expansion of public health and environmental education. In this sense, we can first of all discuss about girls' education. Educating girls is a unique investment. It has an impact beyond the classroom, benefiting entire families and communities. An educated girl will not only be better equipped with strategies for adapting climate change, but will be better able to protect herself from disease, less likely to be sexually exploited, trafficked, and less vulnerable to violence within the family. Educated mothers also have healthier, better nourished children. The second one is water and sanitation in schools. Climate change may also impact school attendance and educational attainment. Due to poor health and nutritional status, children may not be fit to learn even when they have access to schooling. School may also be affected by climate change through environmental pressures on water supply and sanitation. There is need for separate sanitation facilities for girls to motivate parents and girls for attending schools. The third one is increasing education budget. The government budgets are squeezed by climate change impacts such as disasters or droughts. The social sector spending is the first area to suffer. Health outcomes are also enhanced by the education of women and girls. Therefore, there is need to increase education budgets to keep greater numbers of children in school. Enhanced role for schools. Schools have important role in educating children and their families to deal with local environment, livelihood security and adaptation, hygiene and other health protection strategies. Therefore, school must be sufficiently equipped to play this enhanced role. All children will need life skills to understand, adapt to, and cope with climate change. The fifth is emergencies and child protection. Poverty and lack of development exacerbate people's vulnerability to climate hazards. People in low-income countries are 4 times more likely to die in natural disasters than high-income countries. Preempting the consequences of these extreme events is therefore an important part of any development agency response to climate change. The sixth one is protecting children's homes. Climate hazards may increase child vulnerability due to loss of habitat security. Increased rainfall, storms and flooding, and consequent events such as landslides will claim greater number of homes. As a result, greater number of families will be forced into temporary shelter. Therefore, children's homes are required to be provided with vital supplies such as clothing, cooking equipment, bedding, and medicines, besides toys and school supplies. The next is Global Development Partnership. Climate change will make it more difficult to achieve the MDGs 1, 4, 5, 6, and 7. The goal of developing a global partnership for development will address the special needs of least developed countries and small island developing states, that is SIDS. Supporting the LDCs, SIDS, and others to adapt to the impact of climate change is directly relevant to these targets. International development partners, therefore, need to ensure that they are doing enough to support poor and vulnerable people in developing countries to adapt to changing climate. The next one is empowering children to act. Children exhibit a high level of awareness about climate change. This affects their visions and anxieties about their own future. They should be empowered to face the greatest threat to the world's future. The next is engaging children in the response. There is a strong case for engaging children as actors in the climate change agenda. There is need to reassure children that climate change is a threat that can be addressed. Learning from the Cold War could be utilized where children were informed of the nuclear threat in a way that did not leave them feeling helpless. The specific needs of children globally must be taken into account as these will vary widely. So students, let us sum up what we have learned from this module. Climate change is one of the most significant challenges facing children today. Children are already finding the circumstances of their lives have changed. A child born in 2014 will be 36 in 2050, by which time some of the most extreme climate change impacts are expected to have occurred. The impacts of climate change will shape the future for children everywhere. The future impacts of climate change will affect both today's children and the future generations. There will be 30 million more malnourished children by 2050 due to climate change. Climate vulnerability will affect the children of today and the children of 2050, increasing disease, restricting access to education and life opportunities. The future impacts of climate change are expected to have a considerable economic burden on the children of today and future generations. Coping with the impacts of climate change could cost up to 0.7% of global GDP. Children will inherit the outcomes of today's climate change decisions. The intergenerational implications of climate change highlight why climate policy must be devised with children in mind and why their views on climate change are so vitally important and must be heard and acted upon in the decision-making process. Children are to be assured of the right to enough nutritious food, the right to clean water, the right to survive and develop and to receive the best possible standard of healthcare. Every child has the right to education. Young people can also provide innovative solutions, help identify specific risks posed by climate change, and give evidence to help tailor and improve responses to help protect the children. That's all with today's module. I hope you must have enjoyed it. Thank you.